What if time is not a straight road, but a vast landscape, one we occasionally wander without realizing it? Every civilization has imagined time as something orderly, a sequence, a rhythm we can measure with shadows, gears, and now atomic vibrations. We wake, we age, we remember. The past recedes behind us. The future waits, unopened. This belief is so deeply embedded in modern life that we rarely question it. Time flows forward, always has, always will. And yet, scattered across history are stories that refuse to stay in their assigned place. They appear in police reports and academic memoirs, in grainy film footage and forgotten letters, in artifacts pulled from the sea and testimonies shared reluctantly, often years after the fact. Each story is different in detail, tone, and context. But they share a troubling resemblance, a suggestion that time does not always behave as we expect. Sometimes it seems to fold. This documentary journey is not an argument. It is an invitation to sit with uncertainty rather than conquer it, to explore moments where the boundaries between past, present, and future appear less solid than we were taught to believe. The people at the center of these accounts were not seeking fame. Many never spoke publicly at all. Some were academics. Others were workers, travelers, engineers, or ordinary citizens going about ordinary days. What connects them is not belief, but experience, an encounter that placed them briefly outside the familiar flow of time. A man steps into a city street and carries the belongings of a century long gone. Two scholars wander through a garden and glimpse a world on the brink of revolution. A voice appears on the early internet, claiming knowledge that has not yet arrived. A device, corroded and silent, emerges from the sea, carrying mathematics centuries ahead of its age. Each case challenges us in a quiet but persistent way, not with spectacle, but with detail, with consistency, with questions that remain unanswered even after skepticism has done its work. We will not rush to conclusions here. There are no villains hiding secrets, no declarations of absolute truth. Instead, we will slow down. We will listen. We will examine what was seen, what was recorded, and what was left unresolved. Because time, when viewed closely, has always been strange. Physics tells us that time bends near massive objects, that clocks tick differently depending on motion and gravity. Memory tells us that time stretches in grief and collapses in joy. Technology reminds us that the present is constantly dissolving into the past, even as we speak. So perhaps it should not surprise us that human experience occasionally slips its leash. Perhaps the real mystery is not whether time travel is possible, but whether our definition of time has been too small all along. In the chapters that follow, we will move across centuries and continents. We will encounter machines that should not exist, knowledge that arrives too early, and moments when the present seems to blur, allowing something else to surface. Each story will stand on its own. Each will end not with certainty, but with reflection. And together they will form a larger question, one that humanity has been asking in different languages for as long as we have looked at the stars. If the past can echo forward and the future can whisper backward, then where exactly are we standing now? This is not a journey into fantasy. It is a meditation on possibility, on memory, on the fragile confidence we place in the arrow of time. And it begins, as all good mysteries do, not with an answer, but with a pause. It started with a username and a strange message on a forum in the year 2000. The internet was still young. Forums crackled with anonymity and possibility. Amid Y2K fears and .com exuberance, a poster calling himself John Titer claimed something impossible. He was a soldier from the year 2036. Sent back in time to retrieve an obsolete IBM 5100 computer, he wrote with eerie calm and uncanny specificity. Most people laughed. At first, but Titor didn't vanish after a single cryptic post. He stayed. For 2 years he answered questions, described his time machine in technical terms, and painted a picture of the near future that was unsettlingly detailed. He knew about the IBM 5100's undocumented functions, hidden capabilities that even most engineers didn't know about. When IBM insiders later confirmed those secrets, people began to look again. Titer predicted no weapons of mass destruction would be found in Iraq before the invasion. He described mobile devices long before smartphones were real. He talked about global surveillance, social media-induced polarization, and the slow erosion of civil liberties following a terrorist attack, months before 9/11 ever happened. He claimed to drive a 1967 Corvette modified with a General Electric temporal displacement unit. He shared diagrams of the device, explanations of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and blueprints that left physicists intrigued, if not convinced. There were photographs, too. Images of a complex dashboard, control readouts, and what looked like a real, functioning mechanism. Then, in March 2001, just before the world would change forever, he left. One final message. "I'll be leaving this world line shortly. There are only a few safety items I need to check before I leave." He was gone. What lingers is not just the accuracy of what he described, but the restraint. Titer never claimed fame, never sought money. He asked for nothing. And yet, 15 years later, the future he outlined continues to take shape in ways both subtle and staggering. Was it all a hoax? A masterfully constructed fiction? If so, it predicted trends and events with a foresight that borders on the supernatural. If not, if Titer was who he said he was, then he did more than travel through time. He offered us a quiet warning that the future is not fixed, but fragile, that the choices we make matter, and perhaps most chilling of all, that we might already be living in one of the darker timelines he tried to steer us away from. Titer's legacy is not just in the data, it's in the feeling he left behind, a sensation that we are closer to something extraordinary than we realize, and that time itself might be listening. What if the internet wasn't just a tool for communication, but a window? What if someone used that window to speak, not to everyone, but just to those willing to listen? In the echo of his final post, one question remains. What if he was never trying to convince us? What if he was simply passing through, leaving breadcrumbs in the digital dust for anyone curious enough to follow? He appeared out of nowhere, confused, wide-eyed, and dressed as if he'd stepped from another century. On a warm June evening in 1950, Times Square pulsed with its usual chaos. Taxis honked, neon signs buzzed, crowds surged, and then, in the middle of it all, a man darted into traffic. He was struck and killed instantly. It was a tragic but not uncommon accident, until police examined the body. His name, according to the wallet in his coat, was Rudolph Fentz, but everything else about him defied explanation. His clothes were immaculate, black frock coat, stiff collar, high-button shoes, all in the fashion of the 1870s, yet looking newly pressed. In his pockets, a brass token from a long-demolished saloon, an old letter addressed to an unknown person, and banknotes no longer in circulation. Not one item on his body was newer than 1876, and no identification. None of the modern cards, licenses, or items that a man in 1950 would carry. Nothing but silence. Captain Hubert V. Riefmeier of the Missing Persons Bureau felt something about the case didn't sit right. He searched for clues, expecting perhaps an elaborate prank. What he found instead was an entry in a missing persons file from 1876. Rudolph Fentz, aged 29, vanished during an evening walk in New York City. The physical description matched perfectly. The name, the age, even the face, confirmed by a photo provided by a man claiming to be Fentz's son. How could a man disappear in 1876 and reappear alive in 1950, only to die moments later? There were no answers. The case was quietly filed away, deemed too bizarre for public discussion. But the whispers persisted. Among retired detectives and archivists, the story of Rudolph Fentz remained an open question. No one ever explained how his clothes remained pristine, or how he held currency and tokens that hadn't been seen in 70 years, or how his reappearance coincided with a sudden disorientation, as if he'd stepped into a world utterly foreign to him. Eyewitnesses described the same thing. He stood frozen in the street, looking at Times Square as though it were a vision. He blinked at the electric signs, at the automobiles, at the crowd. And then he stepped forward. Was Rudolph Fentz the victim of some strange slip in time? A man pulled forward through decades without warning? Or was he part of some elaborate fiction constructed with astonishing precision? The evidence, real and physical, resists easy dismissal. His clothing, money, personal items, each one verified as authentic to the 1870s. And yet they arrived intact in mid-century Manhattan. If time is a river, did he fall through a hidden current? Was his sudden arrival a fluke, a ripple in the flow of history? Or is this something that happens more often than we know? We measure time in seconds, years, lifetimes. But what if it sometimes bends inward? What if it carries people, unbidden, to places they never intended to go? Rudolph Fentz never told his story. He didn't have the chance. But his presence, brief, bewildered, and out of place, left behind a question that won't fade. What happens when the past comes looking for us and finds us waiting? It began as an afternoon stroll, 2 women, sunlit gardens, and a palace steeped in history. On August 10, 1901, English academics Charlotte Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain visited the Palace of Versailles. Neither expected anything unusual. They were scholars, not mystics, rational, well-read women of their time. But what they encountered that day would come to haunt them for the rest of their lives. The air changed first, a sudden stillness. Colors dulled. Sound faded into a low hush. They felt as though they had stepped out of time itself. As they wandered the grounds near the Petit Trianon, they began seeing people, figures dressed in 18th century clothing moving with quiet purpose. A man in a wide-brimmed hat gave them a stern glance before disappearing down a path that no longer existed. Another sat sketching in the grass, her dress, her hairstyle, the unmistakable resemblance, Marie Antoinette, months before the fall of the French monarchy. Neither woman spoke of it right away, but the unease clung to them. Back in England, they began an investigation, not to prove something paranormal, but to understand what had happened. Over the next decade, they pored through maps, records, journals, and architectural documents. Separately, they recorded what they had seen. When they compared their notes, the match was uncanny, not only with each other, but with historical records not yet published. They described garden paths that had been removed long before their visit, buildings that had been demolished. Even the behavior and clothing of the people they encountered fit the precise customs of late 18th century France. One figure, the man who warned them away from a particular direction, matched portraits of the Count de Vaudreuil, a known companion of the Queen. In 1911, they published their findings under pseudonyms in a book titled An Adventure. It became a quiet sensation and a quiet controversy. Skeptics dismissed it as fantasy, shared delusion, or historical fiction in disguise, but the details refused to fade. Too specific, too accurate. They had knowledge of places they couldn't have seen and people they couldn't have known. Was it a time slip? A wrinkle in the fabric of history that briefly allowed 2 people to witness a moment long past? Or was it something stranger, an imprint of history so strong it bled forward into the present, waiting for sensitive minds to walk through it? The French government took the claim seriously enough to conduct their own quiet inquiry. Their conclusion: the women had somehow described features of Versailles that had not existed for over a century, but had once been real. To this day, the Versailles time slip remains one of the most studied and debated events in psychical research. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was credible. Two women with nothing to gain and reputations to protect shared a moment that didn't belong to them. Perhaps history is not a closed book. Perhaps some pages remain half open, fluttering in strange winds. The garden remains. The palace stands. And some say that under the right conditions, others have seen it too. Shadows of the past flickering through the present. If time is not a line, but a spiral, then perhaps there are places where the loops touch, where echoes of other centuries can still be heard, where the queen still sketches on the grass, waiting to be seen by those who dare to look twice. It came in a letter, postmarked Insanity, written in ink and urgency. In 1955, UFO researcher Morris Jessup received an envelope that would change his life. The handwriting was erratic, the grammar unusual. The sender called himself Carlos Allende, sometimes Carl Allen. He claimed to have witnessed something that should have been impossible, the vanishing of a U.S. Navy ship. According to Allende, the year was 1943. The place? Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The ship, USS Eldridge. The mission, to render the destroyer invisible to radar using electromagnetic field manipulation. What happened, he said, went far beyond invisibility. The entire ship disappeared, physically vanished from view, then reappeared moments later in a blinding flash of light. But the real horror lay in what happened to the crew. Some were missing. Others had fused into the metal of the ship, screaming as their bodies reappeared halfway through solid steel. A few became permanently invisible. Most were never the same, drifting through time in strange episodes, aging rapidly or freezing mid-sentence, only to return minutes later, claiming to have visited other eras entirely. Allende said he had spoken to these men in bars. He watched one of them disappear through a wall. Another aged 30 years in a matter of minutes and died on the floor. Time for them had broken. Jessup, a trained scientist, should have dismissed the story. But Allende's letters were filled with technical knowledge about relativity, magnetic fields, and space-time manipulation that went far beyond anything a civilian sailor should have known in the 1940s. Details that aligned disturbingly well with theoretical physics of the day. And there were gaps, official Navy logs for the Eldridge missing, crew lists that didn't match, newspaper clippings from 1943 mentioning strange incidents near the dockyards, men vanishing, reappearing, confused and disturbed. Jessup became obsessed. He annotated his own books, cross-referenced Allende's letters, and tried to reconstruct the events of that experiment. He reached out to government officials who showed sudden, secretive interest. Then Jessup's car was found running in a Miami park. Suicide, they said, but many believed he had gotten too close to something he was never meant to uncover. The story became known as the Philadelphia Experiment, a blend of science fiction and military secrecy, wrapped in trauma and silence. The Navy denied everything. Officially, the USS Eldridge never left port that day, but the men who survived or vanished told a different story, when they could speak at all. If the account is true, then it wasn't just an experiment in cloaking. It was an accidental breach of time itself, a tear in the veil between moments. And if electromagnetic fields could do that in 1943, what might modern experiments be capable of now? The tale of the Philadelphia Experiment has become legend, blurring fact and myth. But some parts remain disturbingly solid: the missing records, the classified files, the look in the eyes of those who were there and can no longer explain what they saw. Sometimes, in chasing invisibility, we discover things that cannot be unseen. Sometimes, in trying to control time, we lose our place within it. Was the USS Eldridge the site of humanity's first accidental time jump? Or was it merely the first one we noticed? It's just a few seconds of black and white footage. A crowd outside a Hollywood theater in 1928, dressed in coats and fedoras, bustling past the camera. But one figure doesn't belong. In the background of this archival film from the premiere of Charlie Chaplin's The Circus, a woman walks slowly through the crowd. She wears dark clothing and holds something small, flat, and black to her ear. She's speaking into it, pausing, listening, responding. It's unmistakable. She's on a call. But cell phones wouldn't exist for another 4 decades. The footage sat unnoticed for years in studio archives until 2010, when film enthusiast George Clark examined it frame by frame. What he found sent a ripple through the internet and beyond. The object in her hand matched the size and shape of a modern phone. Her body language, distracted, immersed in her conversation, was unnervingly familiar. Digital enhancements showed the device more clearly. It wasn't a radio. It wasn't a hearing aid. And it wasn't an artifact from the 1920s. Kodak confirmed the film was genuine, unaltered, and shot in 1928. The woman wasn't part of the production. She wasn't an actor, an extra, or a known attendee. Hollywood historians couldn't identify her. She simply appeared, then vanished back into the flow of time. Her clothing, while period-appropriate at a glance, had subtle inconsistencies. The fabric, the stitching, the shoes, modern touches that didn't quite match the era. Her haircut was slightly off, as if styled by someone from a different decade. But most of all, it was her behavior. No one around her seemed to notice. No one reacted. As if somehow only the camera caught her. Was she a prankster, an inventor ahead of her time, or something else entirely? The simplest explanation doesn't hold. Wireless portable communication didn't exist then, and even if it did, why would she be using it so openly? Why was she the only one? One theory suggests she was a time traveler, blending into the crowd, recording a moment, perhaps even observing one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century in his prime. If so, she didn't do a perfect job. Something in her posture, in the cut of her coat, in the way she moved, gave her away. Time travel has long been the domain of fiction, but fiction often lingers close to truths we haven't yet proven. What if visitors from the future walk among us not with fanfare, but with silence, not in machines of chrome and light, but dressed in the clothes of the past, quietly watching? The Chaplin anomaly is just one frame in a reel of mysteries. Yet it reminds us that the past is not sealed. It can still be seen, and perhaps still be visited. And so we're left with the question, if someone from the future stood next to you in a crowd, would you even notice? Or would they disappear back into history, captured only by the camera's unblinking eye? It began with a leaking pipe and a routine repair. Nothing extraordinary until the wall opened into something else. In August 2006, Håkan Nordqvist, a Swedish man living in the quiet town of Kalmar, was working beneath his kitchen sink. Water had pooled beneath the cabinet. He reached in, expecting to tighten a joint or replace a washer. Instead, his arm reached into open air. Puzzled, he pushed further. His hand disappeared into darkness. Then, driven by something deeper than curiosity, something like instinct, he crawled in. On the other side, Nordqvist found himself standing in his own kitchen. But it wasn't the same. The layout was familiar, but the details had changed. Sleeker appliances, softer lighting, strange interfaces responding to gesture instead of touch. Screens hovered without frames. The air itself seemed charged with quiet intelligence. And in the living room sat an old man. The man looked up and smiled. "I've been expecting you," he said. It was Håkan, decades older, silver-haired, but unmistakably himself. The two men talked for what felt like hours. The older Nordqvist explained that the tunnel occasionally appeared, just long enough for this meeting to happen. He answered questions about the years between 2006 and 2042, about changes in the world and in their shared life. He even gave the younger Håkon a tattoo, his name and birth date in a style that glowed faintly beneath the skin, created with a technique that left no swelling, no pain, no healing. Then, before the moment dissolved, they posed for a photograph. A camera, not one we'd recognize, clicked silently, and just like that, the tunnel reopened. The younger Håkon crawled back through the sink and into his own time. He stood in the silence of his kitchen. The leak was still there, but the world had changed. Skeptics dismissed the story until they saw the tattoo, an inky design unlike any known in 2006. Experts examined it. The ink was composed of particles not yet in use, arranged in a molecular lattice that suggested advanced fabrication. The photograph added to the mystery. It showed Nordqvist twice, once as the man he was, once as the man he would become. Facial recognition software confirmed it. The same person, aged precisely, with features no digital age progression algorithm in 2006 could have predicted. And then, perhaps most telling of all, Håkon vanished from the spotlight. He didn't seek profit. He declined interviews. He refused to build a brand around the story. He simply returned to his life, marked by an encounter no one could explain and few would believe. His apartment revealed nothing. No hidden spaces. No tunnel. The building plans showed only concrete behind the wall. Yet the tattoo remains. The photograph endures. And so we ask, what if time doesn't always move forward in a single direction? What if, on quiet afternoons, it curls inward, allowing us to shake hands with our future selves? Maybe the most mysterious journeys are not the ones we plan, but the ones that find us. And maybe, just maybe, the future is closer than we think. Waiting behind the walls we never bothered to look behind. It was pulled from the sea, rusted, silent, and impossibly advanced. In 1901, sponge divers off the coast of Antikythera, a small Greek island, discovered the wreckage of an ancient Roman ship. Among the amphorae and statues lay a lump of bronze and wood, so corroded it was almost thrown away. But inside that lump was a mechanism that would shatter our understanding of ancient technology. Known today as the Antikythera mechanism, it is a machine built over 2,000 years ago, an analog computer of staggering complexity. It uses a system of interlocking gears to track the movements of the sun, moon, and planets with mathematical precision. It could predict eclipses, chart lunar cycles, and even keep time with the ancient Olympic Games. But it shouldn't exist. The precision of the gearwork required techniques thought to have been developed over 1,000 years later. Differential gearing, present in modern automobiles, appears in the mechanism. The ratios used suggest knowledge of advanced mathematics, including irrational numbers and lunar orbital variations that weren't formally understood until Kepler and Newton. X-ray and CT scans revealed layers upon layers of sophistication, planetary models, eclipse predictors, calendars synced with the 235-month Metonic cycle. The device could simulate celestial events with an accuracy unmatched until the invention of modern astronomical clocks. And most disturbingly, no other device like it has ever been found. There is no trail of prototypes, no gradual evolution of complexity. The Antikythera mechanism appears as a singular artifact, brilliant, precise, and alone. Who built it? Scholars once guessed it was designed by followers of Archimedes or Hipparchus, perhaps based on lost texts. But recent analyses suggest something more curious. The device was likely designed by a single mind. One person with both the mechanical genius and astronomical knowledge to create a machine centuries ahead of its time. It's as if someone walked into the past carrying the knowledge of the future. What makes the Antikythera mechanism haunting isn't just its existence, it's its silence. After it sank, the knowledge it embodied vanished. The ancient world never built another. The gears stopped turning, and with them a vision of what the ancient world might have been, more precise, more curious, more interconnected, was lost. Why didn't this technology spread? Why didn't its ideas echo forward? Perhaps the builder was a genius born too early, or perhaps the knowledge wasn't born there at all. Some wonder, did someone travel back intentionally or by accident, bringing with them knowledge they shouldn't have? Did the tides of time return them to the future, leaving only gears behind as evidence? Today, the Antikythera mechanism rests in the National Archaeological Museum of Athens. It is studied, modeled, and admired, but it remains unexplained, not just as a machine, but as a message, a whisper from a world we thought we understood, and a reminder that sometimes the past knows things the present has yet to learn. His notebooks are filled with dreams, except they look more like blueprints. Leonardo da Vinci, the quintessential Renaissance man, died in 1519. But across thousands of pages, in ink-stained journals, he left behind visions so precise and technologically advanced, they continue to challenge historians even today. He is remembered as an inventor, an artist, a scientist. But what if he was more than that? What if Leonardo wasn't imagining the future, but remembering it? Inside the Codex Atlanticus and other notebooks, Da Vinci sketched designs for helicopters, tanks, submarines, and flying machines. These weren't vague or whimsical. They were detailed, complete with cross-sections, mechanisms, and measurements. Some mirrored principles of aerodynamics and propulsion that wouldn't be understood for centuries. One design features a vertical screw rotor, a precursor to the modern helicopter. Another reveals a self-propelled cart that resembles the concept of automotive transmission. He drew a diving suit, an armored vehicle, even a machine eerily similar to a modern piston engine. But it wasn't just his mechanical insights that seemed anachronistic. Da Vinci's anatomical drawings show internal organs with a level of precision that rivals modern medical textbooks. His sketches of the human heart depict valve functions not documented until William Harvey's work more than a century later. His renderings of the human brain and nervous system display a grasp of neurology far ahead of his time. Most mysterious of all, Leonardo recorded astronomical observations that should have been impossible. He made references to the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and even the rotation of the Earth, all long before Galileo peered through his telescope. He described lunar craters and hinted at the elliptical orbits of planets. And these ideas appeared suddenly, without drafts, without experiments, just sketches, finished, confident, as if transcribed from something already built. Modern analysis of his handwriting suggests subtle shifts in the sections containing his most advanced concepts. The style changes. The script becomes tighter, more rigid, almost as if he were copying rather than composing. The math, too, often surpasses what was formally known at the time, resembling methods closer to Newton than to any Renaissance mathematician. Could it be that Da Vinci was more than a visionary, that he had access, somehow, to knowledge from another era? It's a tempting thought. A man who seemed to exist centuries before his time, who worked alone, often in secrecy, who left behind puzzles we are only now beginning to decode, but the real question might be more unsettling. If someone in the 15th century could produce designs for future technology so accurate, so detailed, and so complete, where did that knowledge go? Why was it not developed then? Why did it vanish, only to re-emerge centuries later? Perhaps Leonardo was a singular mind, born into a world not yet ready for him. Or perhaps his mind reached beyond the confines of his era into a place we cannot yet understand. He once wrote, "Learning never exhausts the mind. But maybe, just maybe, some minds are remembering more than they learn." And if that's true, then Da Vinci wasn't predicting the future. He was documenting it. It's just a street in Liverpool. Ordinary, urban, alive with shops and footsteps. And yet, something happens on Bold Street, something that bends the rules of time. Since the 1960s, people have reported slipping, momentarily, into another era. Not dreams, not hallucinations, but full sensory experiences of Liverpool as it was decades earlier. Streets transformed, storefronts replaced, cars and clothing altered, and then, just as suddenly, everything returns to normal. One of the most well-documented cases occurred in 1996. Frank and Carol Sayer were shopping. Frank stepped into a bookstore while Carol waited outside. When he emerged, Bold Street was different. Gone were the modern shop signs. In their place stood names and logos from the 1960s. People walked past in vintage clothing. Old cars rumbled by. Even the pavement underfoot had changed. And he wasn't alone. Others on the street appeared equally confused, exchanging glances as if caught in the same waking dream. Moments later, the illusion vanished. The present returned. Investigators found that everything Frank described was historically accurate. Store names, signage, building facades, details no longer visible, but verifiable through old city records and photographs. He knew things he could not have known, and his case was not unique. In 2008, a woman named Sarah Martinez stepped into what she thought was a trendy boutique. Inside, she found herself in a 1970s department store, complete with period fixtures, staff in vintage uniforms, and merchandise long gone from the modern world. When she tried to pay, the cashier looked confused. Her money didn't belong. When she stepped back outside, the boutique and the past had vanished. Some might call these hallucinations, but security footage tells a different story. Cameras have captured people stopping abruptly, turning mid-stride, or gesturing at things not visible on tape. Some seem to be speaking to people no one else can see. Geological studies have revealed something strange beneath Bold Street. Networks of tunnels and mineral deposits known to produce localized electromagnetic anomalies. Some theorists suggest these conditions may create a kind of temporal lens, distorting time in brief, unpredictable pulses. And then there are the patterns. These time slips tend to happen under specific conditions: overcast skies, high humidity, heightened electromagnetic activity, always in the same area, always with the same effect. But perhaps the most intriguing detail is the repetition. Multiple witnesses describe the same shops, the same music playing, the same street performer with the same song. It's as if they aren't seeing the past randomly, but the same exact moment in history. A loop, a pocket of time somehow preserved. Is the past still with us, just out of phase? Are these slips accidental rewinds in a world where time is more flexible than we thought? Or are we glimpsing something even stranger, a kind of residue left behind by memory itself, strong enough to manifest under the right conditions? Bold Street remains unassuming. Pedestrians walk by unaware. But those who have experienced it know better. Time, it seems, does not always march forward. Sometimes it turns a corner and waits. He lay still, eyes closed, lips barely moving. Yet the words that emerged would predict the future with eerie precision. Between 1901 and 1944, Edgar Cayce, an American mystic known as the Sleeping Prophet, delivered over 14,000 readings while in a trance-like state. While many sought his advice on health and healing, others came away with glimpses of events that had not yet happened. Cayce would recline, fall into a deep sleep, and begin to speak. His voice slow, steady, otherworldly. He described distant places he had never seen, people he had never met, and discoveries the world had yet to make. In the 1930s, he spoke of technologies that wouldn't exist for decades. He described people communicating across the globe through handheld devices. He envisioned a vast network that would make knowledge, entertainment, and commerce instantly accessible, a vision that now reads like a blueprint for the internet and smartphone. He warned of a world where connection would breed disconnection, where technology would erode attention and increase isolation. His language was dated, but his insight was not. In medicine, Cayce predicted the discovery of DNA as the key to heredity. He spoke of gene therapy, stem cell treatments, and what now resembles CRISPR editing, all before the structure of DNA was even mapped. He described cellular functions with startling clarity. His accounts of the endocrine system, disease pathways, and regenerative healing processes were far ahead of the science of his time. He even forecast geological and astronomical events. He pointed to specific regions for oil exploration years before they were confirmed. He described patterns of weather disruption, polar shifts, and tectonic activity that only modern instruments have validated. Some of his claims, like the reemergence of a lost civilization near Bimini in the Bahamas, remain speculative yet oddly persistent. In space exploration, Cayce spoke of humans traveling beyond Earth, to the Moon, to space stations, and even to Mars. He described water on the Red Planet, the psychological toll of long-term space travel, and new forms of energy that would emerge once humanity better understood the structure of consciousness itself. But his most haunting predictions weren't scientific. They were spiritual. Cayce believed human consciousness was evolving, that we were moving toward an era where intuition, empathy, and psychic ability would be measurable. He suggested that future breakthroughs would come not through machines, but through a deeper understanding of mind and memory, of time and spirit. While many dismissed him as a mystic or a fraud, scientists studying his brainwaves during trance states found something they couldn't explain. His gamma-wave activity, especially in regions associated with time perception and long-range memory, did not match known neurological patterns. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't theorizing. It was as if he was experiencing the future firsthand. Cayce left behind no inventions, no devices, just transcripts. But those pages still echo, because so many of his visions have already come true. Perhaps the strangest question is not how he knew, but where he was exactly when he knew it. Was Edgar Cayce's mind untethered from time? Did he walk, even briefly, through eras not yet born? Or did the future speak through him, hoping someone would listen? In the quiet between his breaths, we still hear the question, what if time doesn't flow through us? What if we flow through time? The photograph emerged from the sea of digital anonymity like a ripple, small, strange, and impossible to explain. It showed a man wearing modern sunglasses, a graphic t-shirt, and holding a portable camera. He stood out sharply from the crowd around him, men in fedoras and wool coats, women in 1940s dresses. The photo was labeled South Fork Bridge Opening 1941. The internet called him the hipster time traveler. At first, it seemed like a clever hoax, but the photo held up to scrutiny. Experts confirmed it hadn't been digitally altered. The original print, housed in a Canadian archive, had been untouched for decades. The man's clothes? Strange for the time, but not entirely impossible. The camera? Rare, but technically existent. And yet, something didn't fit. He didn't just look different. He looked wrong, as if he were lit by a different sun, as if he knew he didn't belong, and didn't care. This wasn't the first time a single image disrupted the certainty of chronology. From video footage of a woman appearing to use a cell phone in 1928 to paintings showing objects that shouldn't have existed, the visual record occasionally betrays moments that suggest temporal confusion. These anomalies rarely prove anything on their own, but taken together, they whisper of something stranger. What if time travelers don't dress in silver suits or arrive in lightning storms? What if they wear jeans and sunglasses, slip into the past with quiet confidence, and vanish before we can ask the questions? The hipster photo, like so many other cases, walks the fine line between mystery and mistake. Skeptics find plausible explanations. Enthusiasts see evidence. But the deeper question lingers. Why do these anomalies keep happening? Is the past more porous than we believe? Do our records occasionally capture fragments of something that shouldn't be there? Or are we only now noticing the subtle imprints left by visitors out of time? Technology has given us eyes that never blink, surveillance, photographs, satellite imagery, and yet, in that abundance of evidence, we sometimes find threads that don't match the fabric. A person out of place, a device too advanced, a knowledge too early. Each of these could be a coincidence, a glitch, a trick of memory or light, but what if they're not? What if the real time travelers aren't here to change the past, but to observe it, to stand quietly among us, to watch, to remember, and every so often to leave behind a trace, a photograph, a detail, a moment we can't quite explain? Maybe time doesn't need machines. Maybe it just needs curiosity. And maybe, in looking back, we're glimpsing those who have already been looking forward. The hipster remains, frozen in black and white, looking through time. And we are left to wonder, how many others have we missed? There is no roar of engines, no shimmering seedle, just silence. And then, an idea that shouldn't be there. Across cultures, across centuries, stories have emerged of sudden insights, visions of inventions, languages, or truths far beyond the time in which they appear. Sometimes they arrive in dreams, other times as flashes of inspiration that seem to come from nowhere. In 1997, a young engineer in Japan began to sketch a propulsion system for a type of aircraft he had never seen. Its shape unfamiliar, its drive mechanisms unlike anything in textbooks. Years later, he saw nearly identical diagrams declassified by NASA. His version predated them. In rural Brazil, a teenager built a device from scrap metal and magnets that functioned, crudely but undeniably, like a radio. When asked how he learned, he simply said, "I saw it in my head." He had no access to electronics, no teacher, no formal education. These are not isolated cases. They're echoes. Across time, scattered minds seem to tap into knowledge that has yet to be invented. Artists paint scenes from future cities with uncanny detail. Children describe technologies they shouldn't understand. Inventors rediscover designs that, when tested, match the work of engineers working decades later, sometimes continents apart. Is this coincidence or something more? Some researchers believe in what they call temporal leakage, a hypothesis that under the right conditions, information might slip backward through time the way heat moves through metal. Not enough to rewrite history, just enough to seed an idea, spark a vision, whisper a design. Others suggest the human mind may be more than a receiver. It might also be a transmitter, reaching across time, pulling fragments of the future into the present. The implications are staggering. What if some of our greatest inventions weren't born from genius alone, but from contact with something ahead of us? Not aliens, not angels, just ourselves. From tomorrow, it would explain the sudden leaps in history, the moments when civilization lurches forward, not through gradual evolution, but through a single, inexplicable breakthrough. Fire, writing, flight, code. And if that's true, then inspiration is not a spark, but a signal. Each of us, in rare moments of clarity, may be listening to echoes from the future we're helping to build. A shared consciousness stretched across time. A feedback loop between what is and what will be. Not all time travel is physical. Sometimes it arrives as a thought before its time, an idea born out of sequence, a whisper across centuries. And so we return to the question, if time is a circle, where do ideas come from? Perhaps from the only time machine we've always had, the human mind. The future always felt distant, something we might one day reach. But what if it's already behind us, within us, and all around? As we close this journey through stories and whispers, through vanished ships, impossible machines, and minds that see too far, one truth emerges. Time is not what we thought it was. The people we've met along the way didn't set out to prove anything. A man trying to fix a sink. 2 women on a summer walk. A forum poster speaking into the void. Each encountered a moment, a bend in reality, that left them forever changed. They didn't claim to understand it. They only knew it had happened. And maybe that's the point. The mystery of time isn't meant to be solved. It's meant to be felt. We live inside a world that values precision, clocks, schedules, cause, and effect. But time laughs at such control. It loops and lingers. It echoes and forgets. Sometimes it repeats itself. Sometimes it offers glimpses of what's to come, through dreams, inventions, or the quiet gaze of someone who shouldn't be there. Maybe time is not a line, but a conversation. And maybe we are just beginning to learn how to listen. The evidence we've seen, photographs, devices, knowledge ahead of its time, doesn't scream. It hums. It invites wonder, not fear. It calls to something ancient within us, a part that remembers standing beneath stars long gone and feeling that the moment might last forever. There is no final proof, no single case that confirms it all. But taken together, these stories offer something more powerful than certainty. They offer possibility, that the past is not dead, that the future is not fixed, that we, like light, may bend when passing through the lens of the unknown. Perhaps that's what the time travelers were trying to tell us. Not how to escape our era, but how to see it more clearly. To understand that every moment contains the seed of many others. That every action, every idea is part of a much longer story. And what a story it is. A farmer dreams of flying. A painter sees planets. A soldier claims to come from a future shaped by choices we've yet to make. They are not messiahs or monsters, just people, like us, caught in the strange beauty of time's vast terrain. So now we return to the present, to the ticking clock and the glowing screen. But we carry something with us. Not answers, not blueprints, just a question, softly burning. What if time is not a cage, but a key? And what might we unlock when we stop running from the past or racing toward the future and simply listen to the stillness between seconds? Because somewhere, out there or in here, time waits. Not to be conquered, but to be understood and maybe remembered.